and welcome to yet another edition of Benny Boy Ticks Off the Audio Files, or the Oddity Archive, the show that does not complain about everything. Although one thing I am actually quite guilty of complaining about is the old Dolby noise reduction system, which of course was used on pretty much every major commercially released audio cassette for 20, 30 odd years, and was used on a few reel-to-reel albums as well. But I complain because I feel like while, yes, it does cut down on the hiss on a tape and just noise in general, it takes some of the program material with it, and I've just never liked that. But anyway, right at the end of last year, I was doing the thrift store thing, and I stumbled onto this old standalone circa 1972 Teac Dolby noise reduction unit. And of course I picked it up. But what really intrigued me about it upon my initial inspection was that it looked like I could actually control how much the Dolby encode and decode work. And that is true to a point, but that's also the point at which I'm no longer using it properly, as it turns out. There's always a catch. So anyway, today's episode is another one of my little pseudo-documentary affairs, and it's all about my attempts at becoming the hottest audiophile of 1972. Before we begin with the tests, I figured you might want to take a look at the gear itself. And this is a Teac AN80 Dolby noise reduction unit. This particular model was introduced according to HiFiEngine.com and seems to be corroborated by a period sales brochure that I found in 1972. And these things appear to have been done for, in the consumer sense at least, by 77 or 8. And of course, the basic idea here is to implement Dolby noise reduction on both reel-to-reel and cassette decks that are not equipped with the system. Now, I have fleabade a Dolby encoded Barclay Crocker reel-to-reel classical album for this episode, but it is just not turning up in the mail. So, unfortunately, I think that's going to have to be another subject for another day. But anyway, let's take a cut here and take a decidedly more close-up look at the Teac. Starting on the left, we've got a pair of recording level knobs, one for each channel, and these, of course, are to control the level of whatever is being fed into the Dolby unit and subsequently your recordings. Next to that, we've got a button that triggers a built-in 400 Hz tone, but only when the first two switches are set to record. These switches, otherwise, are to monitor recording or playback. There are also two, if you will, screw dials that are used to calibrate the Dolby record levels in tandem with the manual record levels on your tape deck. The other two switches are the main Dolby on-off switch and a switch to toggle between the left and right channels for use in tandem with those first two switches. It's not the most intuitive thing in the world. Next, we've got a single VU meter, because God forbid we get one for each channel, as well as the recording check button, which is just effectively a bypass button you can use while monitoring. And rounding out the front, we've got two more screws that you use to dial in the unity level via your test tapes. And there's the power button. On the back, we've got a ground post and 4 sets of phono jacks, and speaking of the phono jacks, strangely enough, the manual suggests the usual input to output and vice versa hookup, but it actually only works input to input and output to output regardless of what tape deck I'm using, and this also applies to my receiver. So unless someone royally tampered with my particular unit, and it looks awfully clean inside, I'm gonna guess that a certain technical writer screwed up. In the name of full disclosure, these units were, according to the spec sheet in the owner's manual, which is available online, were supposed to either come with or have available a pair of test tapes, one reel to reel, one cassette. And my unit came with neither. And as of the making of this episode, the best price I could find on the correct reel to reel Teac test tape was $70, which I thought was a little steep given that the unit itself was only 12. And I couldn't find the cassette anywhere at any price. But I figured while it obviously won't be exactly to spec, I ought to just try and make my own test tapes. And my logic behind this being that if I've read the owner's and service manuals correctly, both available online, internally, this unit should already be at spec for its job, and that any test tapes I make that play nice within the context of all this should, at least theoretically, in the end, be within spitting distance of the proper end result. Unfortunately, nothing happened with the reel to reel. I barely got started before that experiment ended. So take a look and a listen. I found when undertaking some preliminary tests with the reel to reel that something has gone funky with the record functions on my deck in the not quite year since I used it last. There's a major level disparity between the left and right channels. I can dial in an equal final playback level by ear by trial and error, but there's also a nasty warble that's developed in any recordings I make. So, as you could probably guess, not much was accomplished here. With the reel to reel now back in the for repair pile, everything else for this episode is now, out of necessity, cassette centric. Now, the Teac calibration tapes for these units are all of a 400 Hz tone at quote unquote 0 dB at 200 nanowebers per meter. And no, I did not just make up that word, it's a measurement of magnetic strength. I don't have any scientific way of doing the nanoweber measurement, but I do know that the old cassette Dolby B standard is 200 nanowebers per meter, and that my Dolby B only MCS cassette deck recognizes that level at roughly the plus 3 dB mark. And I can definitely make a Dolby encoded tape at or real close to that level. Actually, I already have. In fact, I've already done all the testing, with the camera mostly in tow. Full disclosure before we start, once again, I fear that I'm slamming headfirst into YouTube's audio limitations with this next sequence, but hopefully a decent pair of headphones in a quiet space will let you hear everything you need to.
And he spends the whole year working out on his sled. It's the little Saint Nick, little Saint Nick. It's the little Saint Nick, little Saint Nick. Just a little bobsled, we call it old Saint Nick. But she'll walk a toboggan with a 4-speed stick. She's candy apple red. I just want to hit a record. Want to hear it on the radio.
Like most of the 60s and 70s tech that I've dealt with on this show, the Teac Dolby AN80 is a slippery, unforgiving little sucker. Between the counterintuitive hookup and operation, I'm actually a little shocked that Teac even let this thing out the door. But I can totally see a one-button, one-touch unit for basic consumer use, which Teac had, and I can totally see a higher-end unit with multiple Dolby circuits and stuff for your own microphone recordings and all, and Teac had a model like that too. But this particular model falls into some kind of weird netherworld. It involves all the tedious calibration and stuff from the more professional-minded units, but little of the useful function on the back end of things. And speaking of calibration, I actually had to recheck the levels every time I used this unit while making this episode, because things would always manage to shift just a little on me. And also, maybe it's just me, but I feel like while the Teac allows a hair, and just that, a hair more breathing room than the built-in Dolby stuff on my MCS deck, proper or not, I think I'd still rather just hear a Dolby encoded tape without the encoding. And I still feel like I'm losing some of the music and especially the space it was recorded in with the processing. But anyway, rant over. Let me get my box back out. This is definitely one of those things that I'm gonna have to revisit somewhere down the line. As I mentioned earlier, the Dolby encoded reel-to-reel album that I ordered for this episode has been hung up in transit for a couple of weeks now, and I guess it's just as well given the recording issues that my deck has developed and the fact that I'm still on the lookout for a hopefully more reasonably priced set of Teac Dolby test tapes. Although let me say that if you've got these tapes and you're willing to lend them to me long enough to make another episode, let me know. But otherwise, as you could probably imagine, I'm not too happy with this little excursion. But having said that, I feel like I've gotten, certainly on the cassette end of things, a pretty good approximation of how it was supposed to sound and work and everything. And I think I've gotten yet another dose of just how spoiled we've become in the new millennium. But anyway, that's it for today's archive. Join me next time when I'm taken to task by a bunch of conveniently, strangely wealthy, middle-aged audiophiles about how everything analog is good and pure and holy and that I'm not taking it seriously enough.